While the psychologists were developing a theory of attitudes and attitude measurement, political scientists at the University of Chicago were beginning the first foundations of quantitative studies of politics that relied on surveys or survey-like measurements. The giants of this were Charles Merriam, the great founder of this school of thought, and I'll focus also on Harold Foote Gosnell, his student or colleague, and much younger colleague, who did pioneering work in the 20s and 30s. Two of those works are worth us discussing briefly. In Non-Voting, the Causes and Methods of the Control of Non-Voting in 1924, and then in Getting Out the Vote, an Experiment in Stimulation of Voting in 1927, Gosnell combined survey techniques with experimental methods in order to assess the factors that affected voting. Both of these studies were a blend of personal interviews and written questionnaires, as well as survey treatments, or rather experimental treatments, that we'll see. In the first of these, the Non-Voting book, Gosnell and his students collected over 6,000 personal interviews with non-voters in the city of Chicago. These were selected by quotas to be demographically representative. So, for example, so many women, so many men, so many old, middle, and young, so many minorities, so many of one ethnic group or another. This is far from random sampling, but was an effort to develop a representative set of survey respondents. Gosnell in this study relied largely on open-ended responses, asking the interviewer to let the respondents speak at length about their reasons for not voting. But then, after those data were collected, the responses were categorized into consistent groups. So, for example, lack of interest in politics was the most common, at 33% mentioning that. A second, lack of the knowledge of the process, how do you get registered and how do you vote, was mentioned by about 11%. And finally, women should not vote as a normative thing. Women should not vote, also 11%, presumably from the women themselves, who had been raised in a culture that opposed women's enfranchisement. And so that's an example of a large-scale interview study, but not yet based on probability samples, and using an unstandardized questionnaire, allowing open-ended responses to then be categorized. In the second book, Getting Out the Vote, Gosnell combined a survey with what today we would call a field experiment. In this, he and his students conducted a complete canvass of 12 neighborhoods, conducting interviews at every household within those neighborhoods. They then separated the households into an experimental group and a control group, where the experimental group got a mailed, nonpartisan reminder on a postcard with information on how to register to vote. A follow-up was then later sent to those who didn't register, and this one was a little more explicit. It had a cartoon depicting why you should register to vote. The control group, of course, received none of these mailings, and so that difference between the experimental and the control group allowed Gosnell to calculate what impact the mailed reminder and exhortation had on who registered and who didn't. So this resulted in a 10% increase in turnout among people who were previously not registered. By modern standards, we would consider that quite a strong experimental effect in the mobilization of turnout, and Gosnell's study is still remembered for exactly that reason. But for our purposes, the survey also conducted a pre-experiment canvass of the neighborhoods that included some 20 measures of political knowledge. Some of these I think we could all probably pass. Who was the father of our country? Who's the chief executive of this state? Some got a little harder, though. How are the judges of the Supreme Court of the U.S. chosen? And what is the only crime the Constitution defines? Those 20 questions allowed Gosnell to construct a detailed measure of political knowledge and probe its effects on registration and turnout and the effectiveness of the mailed experimental treatment, depending on whether you were knowledgeable or not so knowledgeable. It also represents, in the development of surveys, the notion of asking standard questions to the entire group rather than asking open-ended questions that aren't standardized, as we saw in Gosnell's previous study. The scope and complexity and sophistication of measurement in Gosnell's work is impressive even today, and absolutely astonishing for its time. The common element we see developing here across all of these early precursors of surveys is direct measurement of subjective states, which, while not necessarily based on surveys, are easily translated into surveys and which are believed to measure persistent and meaningful attitudes, and that's done via a standardized set of questions. This development from the informal measurements that were done by Booth in the early London surveys through Gosnell's much more structured questions on political knowledge represent one major trend in the development of the modern sample survey, that is, a standardized instrument or questionnaire which asks the same questions in the same way to the respondents, and that for the most part eliminates the interviewer's role and judgment in defining the measures. Remember, Booth allowed the interviewers to reach all kinds of judgments, whereas Gosnell, by this second study, was asking questions that had clear yes or no answers or right or wrong answers, and that were asked in the same way to all of his respondents. That standardization of the questionnaire, coupled with the development of attitude scales from psychology, represents one of the most important developments in the modern survey. The second element that we'll talk about in the next part of this lecture is the development of random sampling methods for populations. We'll be back in just a moment for that.